Hello and welcome to the shed. In today's video we're going to be looking at store-bought lumber that is DAR, which is dressed all round or dressed on four sides in some parts of the world. And I'm going to show you the checks that we're going to do prior to purchasing the timber, and then the checks you want to do to make sure that it's good to go for your next project. This board here we're preparing will be so we can do our upcoming project, which is going to be next week's project, which is going to be just a basic butt jointed box, but it'll be our very first project in this beginner series. And we want to make sure that our timber is good to go so our box looks great. And by the way, if you don't want to miss out on that next week's episode, please hit the subscribe down below and that sub notification bell so you get the recommendation when that video lands. So now let's jump in. So the few things you want to do when you purchase your boards from the store while you're in the store is that you want to make sure that your boards are obviously not warped or pancaked. Now, warped in this length, you want to be checking that it's not wobbly this way, and you also want to make sure that it's actually not cupped this way. Now, they're two basic checks that are relatively easy to do in store, even without any gear. You can do it by eye and it should be good enough for you to use for your project just looking by eye. Now don't forget, timber moves, so you want your timber to acclimatize to the area that you're building it in or where it's going to be before you use it, and that could mean that your timber does move and it does need some work after that. Hopefully your timber's dried enough and the workshop or area that you've got your wood in or stored means that it doesn't warp too much. In this case, this one's barely moved from when I bought it. It has produced a little bit of a warp this way, but for the project I'm going to be using it for, I'm going to be using smaller sections of it. So because there's a little bit of banana along the whole length of the board, I don't have to worry too much about that. But depending on your project, you might have to, especially if you're building a full height cabinet or something and you require the full length of the timber. You may be required to actually do some work on that board, or maybe your joinery can pull your board back into square. It's up to you. It does depend on your project and exactly what you're looking for with your project. Now, one caveat, if you do have to plane your board to get it flat again for whatever it is that you're using it for, you will have to bear in mind that you will change the thickness of the board. Now the board I've got here today is 12mm thick and it is 140mm wide. Now obviously that doesn't really matter, but for the upcoming project that's what I've chosen. What is it that we need to do in order to check these are good to go? Once you've got it back in your workshop and you're ready to do your project, or you're ready to make sure the board's ready to go for your project, what are the checks we need to do? Well, just like the checks we did by eye in the store, to see if it's bananaed and if it's cupped, we want to do those same checks here in the workshop. Now, the very first thing that I like to do is decide which of my faces is completely flat enough to use as a reference face, and if either of the faces are not, what work do I need to do on those prior to choosing that as a reference face. So essentially what we're doing here is choosing a reference face and a reference edge, because as you know from my previous videos, all your joinery comes off either your reference face or your reference edge. So this is kind of important. You need to know and choose your reference face and your reference edge, because it will make a big difference to your project if you don't have a reference face and a reference edge, because you're not going to get good joinery if you don't have that. Now first off here, I recommend the use of a straight edge rather than just using your workbench as a reference here. Now, if you regularly check your bench or it's brand new, maybe it is flat and good to go and you could use that as a reference. However, it's a very poor substitute for something like a straight edge, which is going to give you the best reading on your board. So let's jump in here and we'll get started. One important thing to note when you're choosing a straight edge is you need to take note of which the registered flat edge is. I know some of them have both the bottom and the top, but this particular one, which is a cheaper brand, a quarter brand, it's this top blade that is registered flat, so that's what I'm going to be using to check. So to do this, you want to get down at eye level with it, and you want to be checking for how flat it actually is and where light comes in under the bottom of your straight edge here. And this is kind of an important check because you want to make sure that your board is as flat as it's going to be. And depending on your project, as I said before, you want to make sure that it's within whatever guidelines you've set yourself for the project. Now in this case, I can see a little pin gap under here, and I'll bring you in so you can actually see exactly what this is in a second, just so you can see what I'm seeing. But I have a little slither of light in under this, and I know that this is not 100% flat, but as I said before, because I'm using smaller sections of it, each of those smaller sections is likely to be flat within itself, and if it's not, we can then deal with that at the time of making the project. So I don't know if you can see the slither of light in under this, but there is a little slither of light that I can see via eye here, and I've got this light in behind you to try and help you out to see if you can see it, but the gap is probably less than 1 millimeter. Now we've done that, what do we have to do? Flip the board over. We want to check this side. Now if I look at this side I don't see any gap under. So now that we've chosen which side of our board is flattest with our straight edge, we now need to obviously determine whether the cupping is in the board or not. So yes, we've already done that by eye in the store, but now we want to further refine that and double check it to make sure that we're choosing our best reference face, and whether we need to actually do any hand planing work prior to using this to use it as a reference face. So to do that, if you've got a combination square like the one I've got here, this is an eye gauging one, aluminium, and it's flat enough. We checked it, obviously, if you've seen the video on how to check if a square is square. The same checks have already been done on this, and I know that this is flat. One quick check, if you're not sure, you can actually bring it up to your flat edge or your straight edge and double check it against that to make sure that you're actually using a flat edge, whether that is a combination square such as this or just a ruler. Or you could obviously use your straight edge as well, but using such a long straight edge on such a narrow board is a little bit redundant. What we're going to do is use this, and we're going to run along the length of the board, use our eye once again to see if there's any cupping. It's pretty straightforward, and just as everything suggests, we're going to come in and we're going to look under here. Now, for this board, I don't really see too much cupping. If there is any, you will have to hand plane it, and obviously you'll have to try and hand plane it out. And I plan to do a video in the future that does show you how to actually do that with one of these boards. So we might tackle that in the future. I already have a video on the channel on actually how to, square a rough board. So if you want to find out exactly how to get them flat, do watch that video. I will leave that link down below for you. You can use your hand plane to do this as well. That's one thing I did fail to mention. You can use your hand plane because that does allow you to do this as well, because if you've already flattened your hand plane sole, and I'll leave that link down below as well if you don't know how to do that, of your hand plane like this and do the exact same technique, looking for light across and under the sole. With this side of this board, there's not enough cupping to worry about doing anything with it. I couldn't see any visibly, which means if there is any, it's so minute that you're not even going to notice it. So now I've determined that this is our perfect reference face, we can go ahead and put our mark on here. Little squiggle like that pointing to the edge. So I've gone ahead, I've put those marks on both sides because we haven't determined which edge is actually our reference edge. So let's do that now. So how exactly do we go about determining whether that is square? Well, it's quite simple, as you would expect. We use a square. Now you could go ahead and use a little square like this, do our referencing along here like this. However, I know we've determined there's no cupping in this, but you're going to get a more accurate square mark across here using a square that actually has a wider fence. Whether that is a combination square such as this, or just a vintage tri-square like this. Both of these squares have a longer reference, as you can see, about double. So you're going to get a better indication of square off your face from that. So in order to do that, we're going to bring our fence in, reference on our face, and we're going to check, looking down our board, to determine where square is. And if it's anything like this board, it's pretty good. So once again, what we want to do is now mark that as our reference edge. It's square to the face, so there's no need to check the other side. The other side may be square, but we only need one reference face and one reference edge, which we now have. We've determined which edge is going to be our reference edge because it is square, as you could see there. There's no need to check the other side. The other side might be square as well, but we only need one reference face and one reference edge, so we're actually good to go ahead and mark our reference edge now. So let me bring you in here and I'll show you how I mark that. First of all, what I want to do is scratch out my other reference squiggle that we put on the face before when we determined which face it was, just so we don't get confused. And now we're going to have that one mark. So if we look here, I'll cross that mark out up here, and on this side just here, we're going to put a little pointer with the point facing up and meeting the squiggle on this side just here. And once that's done, you might want to put that in a few spots along the edge of your board, especially if you're doing joinery in a box and you've got all the small parts and you want to maintain where your reference face and reference edge is. You can remove them later, but it's important to know where that reference face and edge is in case you need that face or that edge when you're running your board on a shooting board because you want to square them up after you've cut them. It's just important to maintain that. So when you're doing your project, you might want to actually put those reference marks on each piece just so you can maintain it until you get ready to do the assembly. Up until now, we've determined that our board has no cup. We've determined that there's no bananaing on it because we've used our straight edge. We've then determined which side is our reference face via doing those two. And then we've used a square to determine which side we're going to be using as our reference edge. If your board is not as smooth as mine is here, you might want to put a very fine set smoothing plane to the surface to smooth it out, and in which case you would want to redo those marks, but you would have to redo your checks as well. Mine is dressed all round. It's smooth enough for the project that we're going to be doing, so I don't need to make any changes there. If you do need to make changes, well, you might want to pause this video and catch back up to this if you're following along. The last thing I like to do, now that we've got a reference face and reference edge, is to actually square both edges of the board so you can actually start from either end when you come to do your project. Now, I like to do this because I find that most of the time, dressed round timber, although it's been cut to length, don't do the end grain of your board. So, if you've got your shooting board, let's pull that out, grab your shooting plane, or your plane that you're using to shoot your boards, and let's drop this onto a shooting plane and square up those edges, ready for the project. So we obviously want to take our board as you usually would. You want to take your reference face and your reference edge and have your reference face facing down. Now, there's no real reason that you have to use your reference face facing down, but if you can in this situation, why not? You might as well. Most importantly is this reference edge here is up against our fence. We want to make sure your plane is pushed up against your little fence ridge on your shooting board, and then you want to push your board up against that. So we're down like this, pushing reference edge up against the fence. Hand plane on this side, pushed in against the little referencing ridge here. Push your board up against it. Now, I don't know if you can see from here, but we've got quite a gap just here. We're out by at least couple of millimeters, so we're going to have to work this back and forwards. So you can hear that sound as it's engaging, so you know that you're actually planing right through as you're going, and that's important. You want to make sure that you are actually engaging your timber and that that edge or that end is square, because this is going to square it up. So you heard that sound there. We just made a full length shaving on our end grain, which is quite incredible for end grain, but it's no surprise considering I actually have a dedicated shooting plane here. You'll get that same effect with any plane that you use as long as your blade is sharp. The other thing you want to make sure is this material here, which is your shavings, doesn't get in between the gap of your plane and your little reference fence here, because that will throw your plane out of square. So now we've gone ahead, we've done this edge. We can then double check it with a square, like so, and if we have a close look at that, we can tell that that is actually square right the way across there. There is no gaps. So let's jump in, do the other side. Now that our ends are square to our reference edge, our face and our edges are square, we're ready to essentially do joinery off this. With one caveat. If you had any of this cupping or anything or warping that you need to redo or sort out, you need to do that at this stage before you go ahead with your project. And obviously if you've bought a board and you've gone through these stages and you picked a decent board to start with, which is as quarter sawn as you could, and I'll talk about what that is later on in another video, so don't worry about that at the moment. One other thing is that if your board, although these are dressed, might not be smooth enough to your liking, you might want to put a very fine set hand plane and hand plane the whole board, or you could leave it and just hand plane your parts. If you're doing a box, you might want to do that after you've already cut them to length, because it's going to be easier to work with the smaller parts. Depends. I usually find hand planing the larger boards a little bit easier. But if it's like a box, and if you're doing dovetails, you definitely do this, is after you've assembled, you might want to hand plane the outside of your box after your assembly is complete, which is what I prefer to do, especially with what we're using this board for, which is making a butt jointed box. So the hand plane will go to that box after it is assembled. And you really need to look at what your project is and exactly what is required from the timber that you're using. Now, if it's a tabletop, you might keep the underside of your tabletop rough because it's not seen. Inside of a cabinet, you might keep that rough because once again it's not seen. The back of a cabinet, something like that. So if it's something that you don't need to see with your eye, you don't have to necessarily worry about smoothing your board. If you've bought a decent board and used your eye to check your board over prior to buying it from the store, you may need to do no smoothing, and for me, this board is smooth enough for the project that I'm going to be doing, especially for a beginner project, so I would say don't worry about it too much. However, if it does bother you, go ahead, have a very, very fine set hand plane, and just go for it. If you like this video, please like and subscribe down below. It helps the channel out more than you know. And if you'd like to support me a little bit further, while you're down there, please consider checking out giving this video a super thanks if you got some value out of it. That'd be much appreciated. Or checking me out on Patreon, and that link is in the description below. So if you'd like some more beginner videos like this one, please check out the video on the screen here right now, and also the beginner playlist that this video is part of. Bye for now.